back to Vinyl Friday, where I go through my records in alphabetical order like a big nerd and talk about why I love them. Last week was a mammoth episode. It featured research and field reporting. It was 33 minutes long. So today, friends, I thought we'd do something lighter and simpler and just good old-fashioned fun. Not to mention alphabetical. Today we embark on our journey through the letter G. Those of you who are here for the Beatles, fear not. Next Friday we will be doing Here, There, and Everywhere. Today's album obviously isn't going to be as big as the Beatles' Revolver, but it is my favorite cult album. It is by a composer named Mort Garson, and it is, and I quote, full, warm, beautiful mood music, especially composed to aid in the growing of your plants. The album is called Plantasia, and it sounds like this. But it also sounds like this. And this. You get the idea. So who is this Mort Garson character? Well, early in his career, he composed songs for artists like Cliff Richard.
Only you forevermore, 'cause you're my theme for a dream.
He wrote the string arrangement for Glenn Campbell's By the Time I Get to Phoenix.
By the time I make Oklahoma, she'll be sleeping.
Massive international hit, that one. In 1967, he met Robert Moog at a convention for engineers, following which he became one of the earliest composers on the Moog synthesizer. Yes, that is the very same instrument that is played throughout the Beatles' Abbey Road. Which makes me think maybe in these non-Beatles episodes I should engage in a little game of Will It Beatles? You're welcome to join me in this pursuit to see whether today's artist in some way connects to the Beatles, because I'm of the opinion that basically everything does in one way or another. So there's today's link. The Beatles were also early adopters of the Moog synthesizer on the album Abbey Road. You can hear it on tracks like Here Comes the Sun, Maxwell Silverhammer, among others. Plantasia. Will it Beatle? Yes, it will. Beatles aside, Mort Garson's electronic experiments came to embody the name space-age music when his compositions were used as incidental music for the televised Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969, which is pretty exciting. To be able to say that you were the soundtrack for the moon landing? What? I also really love his quote about it. Of this composition, Mort Garson says, and I quote, "I used a big symphonic sound for the blast-off, some jazzy things for the zero-G game of catch, psychedelic music for a section that uses negatives and diffuse colors on shots taken inside the ship, and a pretty melody for the moon. After all, it's still a lovely moon." Right you are, Mort. Famously, to this day, it continues to be a pretty lovely moon. Which brings us to this ridiculous, beautiful album. In 1976, Mort Garson was inspired by his wife's plentiful houseplant collection, and he thought he would write a collection of pieces to inspire them to grow. Hence the subtitle on this cover, Warm Earth Music for Plants and the People Who Love Them. I can't tell you how much I adore that. Warm Earth Music. My favorite detail about this album is that in 1976 you could only get yourself a copy of this album if you bought a houseplant from the store Mother Earth in Los Angeles, or if you bought a specific brand of mattress from Sears. And then sometime last decade, someone uploaded it to YouTube and it blew up. That's actually how I found it. The YouTube algorithm was like, hey, you might enjoy this album, have a listen to it, and much to my disdain, the algorithm was right. It often is. Damn those robots. So after it blew up on YouTube, the original vinyl copies increased in value to like $600 a pop. That is US dollars, mind you. Now ultimately, it was re-released in 2019. This is not a $600 copy. This is a 2019 reissue. And I'm so glad that they did reissue it, because when you meet somebody who likes Plantasia or has a Plantasia t-shirt or a Plantasia sweater, it's kind of like a secret club that you're part of, you know? And now you can be part of the secret club too! Another thing I love about the story of this album is his daughter's quote about its increase in popularity. Friends started telling me there was a whole bunch of Plantasia on YouTube. I thought, you've got to be kidding me. I looked at it myself and thought, that's one bunch of crazy people. She continues, there's pieces my dad did that are so stunningly beautiful and heartfelt, but this just didn't do it for me. And she says of her mother, the original plant owner, she thought he had gone off the deep end. And I'm glad he did, because we get this incredibly niche, very trippy album out of it. Lucky us. On this album, each song is named after the plant it was intended for. So for instance, we've got Symphony for a Spider Plant, Concerto for Philodendron and Pothos, Rhapsody in Green, Mellow Mood for Maidenhair, and my favorite, Music to Soothe the Savage Snake Plant. There's so much to love about this crazy album. And oddly enough, I think that he does manage to capture the mood of each of those plants. I guess as a composer though, it is his job. Now, at the point where this album was being made, there were a handful of music works that had come out on electric instruments that were for sort of popular consumption, like Wendy Carlos's Switched on Bach, which came out in 1968. But for the most part, electronic music was an experimental music, not necessarily for public consumption. Now, it may seem counterintuitive to explore why a wild and crazy album of experimental music from 1976 is great by pivoting to acoustic orchestral instruments, but I'm gonna do it anyway, and I'm of the hope that it will all come together and make sense at the end. Wish me luck. Here we go. A standard Western orchestra is composed of 4 main groups of instruments. We've got our woodwinds. Some examples would be flute, or clarinet, and strings, like violin or cellos. Percussion, like timpanis, or cymbals. Brass, like trumpets, or tubas. My take, and this may not be unique to me, is this. The groupings of instruments within an orchestra are so selected because within each group there's a broad range of frequencies that the instruments can achieve, but between the groups there's a broad range of timbre, or tones, that you get from each of the instruments. So for example, if you take the woodwinds, you could have an instrument like the contrabassoon that plays really, really low frequencies. And that can go all the way up to an oboe, which plays much higher frequencies. But if you're taking similar frequency ranges, you can compare like the contrabassoon with a tuba or a double bass. All of them play really low frequencies, but they have radically different tones between them. So that's sort of fundamentally how an orchestra works, in my view anyway. Hopefully orchestral music purists won't take too much issue with that. And if they do, I think I have the emotional resilience to deal with that. Today, anyway. On this album, I would say that the same is true, except that that entire orchestra is contained within a single instrument, the Moog synthesizer.
The Moog synthesizer. It produces sounds in a matter of minutes which would normally take radiophonic experts with their complicated equipment days of work and multiple re-recording to achieve. You create your sounds simply by plugging into the right holes. When you've done this, they can be played on the keyboard. The instrument is called a synthesizer because the sound of any musical instrument can be built up electronically. That,
I believe, is a big part of why this album is so compelling to me, and I think it is such a grand oeuvre. I don't know what the English pronunciation of that French word is, and I think I'm butchering the French pronunciation of said French word. Hopefully the French linguists among us won't take too much issue with that, because I'm not sure that I have the emotional resilience to deal with that today. If you take issues with my music theory, let me know in the comments. If you take issue with my French accent, please kindly keep it to yourself. Let's take some examples from the first song. It opens on a sort of mid-frequency arpeggio, which, to recap from the Electric Light Orchestra episodes, is when you take a chord, you split it into its constituent parts, and you play them in sequence. And it can be basically any sequence. You can go like ba 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 ba, or ba 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 ba, or in this case, ba 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 ba. And while I'm certain that was beautiful. I can assure you it's even better on the original recording. Here we go. Nice little mid-frequency arpeggio. In comes the melody. Very high frequency, has a totally different profile. The arpeggio sounds kind of like rounded and comfortable. The melody comes in and it sounds much like sharper, brighter, and it's way higher. Later in the song we have this sort of lower frequency start to blossom in, and that has a sort of more on the nose, almost honk to it, like this. A lower frequency joins them, and that has more of a sort of plodding, plunky tone to it. Sort of more of a bass instrument. So there you go, you've got some bass, you've got some sort of tenor, you've got some treble. You're covering a range of frequencies, and each is making a totally different noise. Very similar to an orchestra. And in fact, that's not the only way that it draws from classical traditions. In that sense, it's sort of following in the footsteps of Switched on Bach. Also a great album to check out if you're enjoying this weird shit. Editor Nancy here. My friends, I have tried and failed to find a single clip from Switched on Bach on the entirety of the internet TM. My sincerest apologies. For instance, we've got the arpeggio. The arpeggio, as a concept, features heavily in classical music. There are many examples, but a good example might be Bach's Prelude in C minor, which sounds like this. Interestingly, when the Beatles use the Moog synthesizer on Abbey Road, at least two of those instances are arpeggiated. On Here Comes the Sun and on Because. And Because is a song that is heavily inspired by Moonlight Sonata. Which is largely arpeggiated. We also came across this concept quite a lot in the Electric Light Orchestra episodes. But again, their music is orchestral. It is very classically influenced. This opening track has some beautiful chords, and they are all broken up into those arpeggios. I don't have a Moog synthesizer, so I just used a generic synth, but this is what the arpeggio on this track sounds like. So, that's arpeggios. On to the next thing. This first track features contrapuntal melodies. Counterpoint is when you've got a couple of parts in a piece of music, and they are harmonically interdependent, so they're clearly part of the same song, but they're also independent melodies, so they're not just doing the same thing as each other. You hear it in quite a lot of Baroque music, like for instance, the Sonata by Scarlatti. When you listen to it, you can hear that there is a treble melody and a bass melody, and they are both in the same key, contributing to the same piece of music, but in their own terms. They're arriving at the same destination and taking different paths to get there. I think that makes sense. Makes sense to me. Hopefully it makes sense to you. Otherwise, I'm just sitting here talking to myself. A good example of this is that sort of honking part that I was telling you about earlier in the episode. Right here. So the high harmony is doing this sort of ooh, while the bottom part is going ah. They're working together for the same purpose, but they're playing their own melodies to get there. This song is becoming increasingly polyphonic. There are more and more voices being added, but they're not doing the same thing together. And then all of those little voices are joined by a bunch of other voices, and they come together to form this triumphant symphonic central motif, which I think is a very orchestral approach. Here. And you find that sort of explosive, triumphant, I don't know, chorus equivalent maybe, in lots of classical music. A good example might be the Triumphal March from Verdi's Aida, which sounds like this. Even the name draws from classical music, because a fantasia is a form of music that's sort of composed with a free form. But fantasia also refers to something that is a mix of different styles, which of course this is, because he's taken all of those classical components and shoved it into the middle of the 20th century with these very sort of technologically minded electronic sounds. It's called warm earth music for plants. And I think that that's accurate because a lot of these synth sounds are very bouncy, goofy, and kind of trippy. The tones sound round as opposed to sharp. That's how it best makes sense to me. All of that translates to something that is warm. It sounds like warm earth music. I see it as a triumph. So then I guess my central point for this whole episode is that just because it's played on a Moog synthesizer doesn't mean that it's not valid, proper music. It shouldn't be dismissed as something that is silly or simply niche. To demonstrate this point, let's re-envision the beginning of this song as a piece performed on orchestral instruments. For example, let's take the arpeggio at the beginning of the song and replace the synth with strings. Maybe a little flute to carry that top melody. You see what I mean? He's taken this one instrument and created two instruments of radically different tone and frequency range so that it doesn't sound like they're all doing the same thing. Maybe about this point we bring in some cello at the bottom and some warm French horn to carry that counter melody against the flute. And here we are, 4 instruments out of a single instrument, all moving in the same direction, but doing vastly different things. And I'm no orchestral arranger, but maybe the B part can sound like that. Ta-da! Legitimate music. If you haven't heard this album before, I hope you do give it a listen because it is a joy to experience. If you were an existing member of this secret club, I hope you had as good a time as I have. Thanks for hanging out with me. If you enjoyed this episode or you would like to support any of the weird things that I do, I will leave a link in the description for my Buy Me a Coffee page, where you are most welcome to leave a donation, if you wish. No pressure, friends. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you here next week. Have a great weekend! For the televised Apollo 11, nope. An example might be the Triumphal March from Aida by... Aida? We Google.
Act 2, Scene 2 of Aida.
Okay, good.